Welcome to part 2 of the 8 forms of noise. In the last video, we discussed the first 4 forms of noise. They were the time gap, the geographical gap, the cultural gap, and the language gap. In this video, we will discuss the last 4. They are the literary gap, the supernatural gap, the theological gap, and the appropriation gap. These challenges are what scholars call noise or gaps in understanding. And these are anything that interrupts the flow of communication between the sender and receiver. These 8 components come from Fuhr and Kostenberger's book called Inductive Bible Study. You might find these worded differently or see more or less of these in different places, but generally speaking, this is a great way to encompass the challenges or gaps in understanding we will face when interpreting Scripture. The literary gap. To understand this challenge, you must understand what a literary genre is. Some examples in our day would be satire, the comics in the newspaper, or maybe an opinion article. A few more would be poetry, an instruction manual, a love letter, or maybe a textbook on law, psychology, etc. We know intuitively to read the comics differently than we would an article on politics. We automatically adapt our hermeneutics or principles of understanding based on the genre we are reading. Again, the authors from Inductive Bible Study give a great summary about the literary gap. They say, the literary gap stems from the fact that the Bible is an ancient human book written by dozens of authors in a variety of literary genres. As such, we should expect the text of Scripture to have been written in styles unique to ancient literary culture and language. What places the Bible in a class of its own, however, is the variety of literary techniques found in Scripture. Because the Bible was written by so many authors over such a long period of time, reflecting such variety in purpose and origin, the outcome is a text representing a dozen or so primary genres and many more subgenres. The literary gap recognizes that most readers will not inherently know the rules of engagement appropriate to the respective literary genre at hand. Yet knowing these rules is absolutely essential in gaining a more informed and accurate interpretation of a given portion of Scripture. The literary gap is a challenge we cannot underestimate. If I say I am going to the store for milk, you or I would automatically understand it. However, if you try to read William Shakespeare's Macbeth, written in 1606, you will have a big literary challenge on your hands. Even though it was written in early modern English, it makes little sense to you and I. We would need to use different principles to understand the phrase, fair is foul, foul is fair, for instance. The phrase is used to highlight the hypocrisy that people adopt to hide their true intentions. Shakespeare uses this theme to caution about judging things based on the face value. See? If we just tried to understand it literally, word for word, there is little chance that we would understand that phrase in that way. The supernatural gap. The next 3 challenges were as difficult for the early believers as they are for us. The supernatural gap is a challenge because the Bible speaks about supernatural events and miracles as if they are as normal as natural occurring events. It doesn't try to explain them, and sometimes even calls out God's followers for their lack of belief. The challenge is that to God, supernatural events are as natural as everyday occurring events. So when He is speaking to us, who must rely mostly on our 5 senses, it can become a challenge for us to overcome. Fuhr and Kostenberger put it this way: for modern readers who are steeped in naturalistic thinking, a supernatural gap opens up when they discover that they can't replicate the miracles of the Bible in a modern scientific setting. The theological gap. We see in the Bible that God reveals Himself in the context of human history. This also means that He has been progressively revealing Himself, starting with Genesis, and continuing through the book of Revelation. Because of this, the Old Testament saints weren't as well informed of God's nature and attributes as we are today. And taking into account the dual authorship of the Bible of God with each of the authors, His progressive revelation of Himself never contradicts earlier truth about Himself, but sometimes gives fuller explanation. The theological gap poses other challenges too, because God is eternal, all-knowing, omnipresent, all-powerful, sovereign, or in control of everything. He is writing through the human authors about concepts that aren't part of our human nature. We don't have any concept about things like always existing or being everywhere present at once. Therefore, we may be tempted to doubt what we can't possibly understand. A good mindset when dealing with this challenge is to just believe that we have limitations in our understanding. Just as there is a gap between us and dogs, for instance. We can interact with them, but there are limits of understanding that would never allow them to build a skyscraper or learn to converse with us. It doesn't mean that we can't have deep connections with our pets, though. In the same way, we can bridge this gap partially, but there is a theological gap between us and God that we can never bridge fully as we are finite beings, and God is infinite in every way. The appropriation gap. Fuhr and Kostenberger say this about the appropriation gap. Even once we bridge the gaps to interpretation, we still must transfer the message from interpretation to application. This is often a greater challenge than interpretation, but absolutely necessary. Some commandments, exhortations, examples, and instructions in Scripture are directly transferable, while others are historically or theologically constrained and don't apply to us directly. Between these options, many degrees of application are possible, including finding cultural equivalents and drawing principles from the text, both practical and spiritual. But this is a nuanced art that requires not only interpretive skill, but also spiritual seasoning and maturity. Even though these challenges are real, the good news is that God initiated the relationship with us and is actually more concerned about connecting with us than we often are about Him. These challenges mentioned aren't meant to discourage you, but to make you aware of your need to at times redirect your interpretation methods. In the next video, we will discuss some principles we can use to overcome these challenges as we read Scripture.